All right, guys, today we're going to review the reading strat chunk and summarize. And our primary goal here is to one, outline a brief purpose and definition of this reading strategy, outline real quickly how it can be done, and outline what the summary does and the major purposes for it. Now, I will say that whenever reading a larger, longer, particular piece of text, students tend to get stressed out. We see those really long paragraphs, those really big words, and those really complex sentences, especially when it comes to some of the more archaic stuff that we might see on, say, a standardized test, for example. But one thing we can do is to chunk and summarize. And what we do is essentially is we take that long, magnificent piece of writing with all those big fancy sentences and archaic words, and we break it down into several pieces to make that text slightly more manageable than what it was. And there's any number of ways to do this, but the major purpose here is to help manage comprehension by one, managing stress, but primarily, we manage comprehension by shrinking down the amount of reading we have to do and then summarizing those pieces, and then we can assemble them together a little more easily. So, how do you do it? What are some ways that you can work on this? Well, one, you can take this and break it down by sentence. And I wouldn't recommend doing this on something that's a little more less complex and complicated. But if you run across something like, oh, I don't know, something from Jane Austen, for example, some of those more Victorian romantic era texts, or anything prior to the 1950s, for example, sentences might work because the sentences themselves might be really, 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 really long. Another way is to go by paragraphs. And so this is probably the most commonly used. For all intents and purposes, what we like to do is we like to number our paragraphs, and then we like to take a few of them, maybe one, maybe two, maybe three, it just depends on the text, and kind of group them together. And we do that through the use of brackets, essentially a square parentheses. And that's just an annotation so that I know where my chunk ends and where my chunk begins. Another way is via sections. And so this is probably pretty common in informational text, but sometimes you have to watch them because not always do all the paragraphs line up exactly by topic. Essentially, what you're going to look for here, your hallmark, are headings. Those bold-faced labels and the italicized subheadings that tell you when subjects are about to change. But make sure that you keep track paragraph to paragraph um, through those to make sure that all of the paragraphs line up. You don't want to break up a chunk and have a random paragraph show up somewhere else that belongs in a different section. Another one is by chapter, and here we're thinking primarily about literature. And by chapters, especially in short stories, you might see Roman numerals that break up the various portions of a text. I want to make sure that I keep an eye on those. And depending on how long they are, I might be able to use those sections. But really, I want to use probably a combination of these. And the one I want to focus primarily on, really, is topic and subject. So, really, the ones that I'm going to focus primarily on is one, paragraphs, and two, topic and subject, because those in conjunction with my use of headings or my section headers is really going to be the best way. So I don't want to treat these in isolation. I'm only going by paragraphs. You don't really want to do that because it just depends on, oh, I'm only going by headings. You don't really want to do that either because that might ignore the fact that there could be a paragraph in the next section that relates to the previous subject because the author is transitioning from one idea to the next. You really want to keep an eye on all three of those. But once you do that, once you go through and you've chunked and you've summarized the whole thing, what's the primary goal after that? Well, that's where my last piece of the puzzle comes in the form of a summary. And here I'm going to take those sections and I'm going to highlight the important information, and I'm going to make a few questions and connections myself. I'm going to focus on those primary main ideas, and perhaps in somewhere between 1 and 3 sentences, I'm going to write a very brief summary of that section, just the meat and potatoes of what that section of the text is about. And remember, this is all about breaking up a text, taking something that is incredibly long and stressful and making it much more manageable. All right.